Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Meditation Prep. January 30, 2008. Meditation isn't a lap belt. You can't just squeeze your mind into a single technique and expect the technique to do all of your work for you. You've got to develop the proper attitudes toward meditation, proper attitudes toward your mind. In addition, you've got to develop a range of techniques and learn how to determine which technique to use at which particular time for which particular problem, so that you can use the techniques wisely for their intended purpose. They're not meant to be straitjackets for the mind. They're more means for exploration. As the Buddha once said, he points out the road, but it's up to you to follow the road, to see what you learn along the way and to discover where it takes you. In many cases, the good techniques actually present you with questions more than they provide you with answers. You've got to develop the right frame of mind for taking up the questions and figuring out how to get the right answers that help put an end to sewering. To get an idea of what these attitudes are that you need to bring to the meditation, it's good to look at what the Buddha taught his son, Rahula, prior to teaching him how to focus on the breath. There are two main sets of instructions. In the RST set, the Buddha started his meditation instructions not by telling Rahula to sit and close his eyes, but by telling him to develop the right attitude toward all of his actions, his thoughts, words, and deeds. In other words, Rahula was going to get practice in how to be a meditator by looking at his actions in all situations. First, the Buddha established the principle of truthfulness. If you're the sort of person who feels no shame at telling a lie, he said, then you have no value as a meditator. You've thrown your value away. If you find it easy to lie to other people, it's going to be easy to lie to yourself. So truthfulness was the RST principle, the RST attitude the Buddha recommended. Then, he said, you apply that truthfulness to your thoughts, words, and deeds before you act, and keep reminding yourself to act only on harmless intentions. This develops the qualities of goodwill and compassion. When an intention comes up and you're thinking about following it through, ask yourself, is this going to be harmful? If you can perceive some potential harm, don't do it. If you don't foresee any harm, you can go ahead and do it. While you're acting, look for the immediate results coming from your action, because actions can bear their results not only in the long-distant future, but also right here, right now, where you can immediately see them. If you stick your finger in it hurts right now. It's not going to wait to hurt you in some future lifetime. If you swallow hot soup, it'll scald you now, not after you die and are reborn. So if you see any harm coming from your action, stop doing it. But if you don't see any harm either to yourself or to others, you can continue with it. When the action is done, look at its results over the long term. If you realize that it did cause harm over time, develop an attitude of shame about the action. Now, notice that the Buddha is not saying to be ashamed about yourself, he wants you to feel shame toward the action. In other words, view the action as something beneath you. That's a healthy use of shame, it's the companion to a healthy sense of pride. Make up your mind that you're not going to repeat the action, and then go talk it over with someone you respect. This develops an attitude of integrity, that you accept responsibility for what you've done, and are open about what you've done. This way you can learn. So the Buddha doesn't start out by telling Rahula not to make mistakes. He says to try to avoid making mistakes, but if you do make a mistake, this is how you handle it, with honesty, with an attitude of harmlessness or compassion, with a healthy sense of shame, and with integrity. If, on the other hand, you look at your actions and see that they haven't caused any harm, you can take joy in the fact and keep on practicing. That's how you start meditating in your daily life. Those are the attitudes you want to bring to the meditation. A willingness to look at your intentions and to look at their results. This is going to be really important in the course of your meditation, because there's no other way you'll be able to read your own mind. Then, at a later time, the Buddha taught Rahula breath meditation. But before he taught him breath meditation, he taught him 10 other exercises to prepare him for the breath. The RST4 exercises deal with the physical elements, looking at the body in terms of its elements, its properties. Earth is solidity, water, liquidity, heat, and wind, motion. He said to Rahula, try to make your mind like each of these elements, each of these properties. For example, with earth. If you throw disgusting things on earth, earth doesn't react. Now the Buddha is not telling Rahula to be passive or oblivious. He's saying to be grounded, to learn powers of endurance. Because as you'll see, the meditations he taught Rahula further on are active kinds of meditation that require a lot of sensitivity. You don't simply sit with whatever's there without making any changes. You are supposed to adjust and change things. But if you want to make the proper changes, you have to understand where you actually are and what the problem actually is. Then make your changes and watch to see if they actually work. Now, to be able to watch to see things clearly, you have to have powers of endurance, the ability to sit with things and watch them steadily over time. Unpleasant things are bound to come up in the meditation for sure. To comprehend them, after all, is the duty with regard to suffering and stress. You've got to comprehend it. And to comprehend it, there are times when you'll have to really sit with it, to watch it over time, again and again and again. This requires endurance. Then when you try changing something in the meditation, when you experiment with your breath and your mind in various ways, you've got to sit with things for long periods of time to see if what you did really works. You don't want to be the sort of person who makes a little change, sees a little something that looks promising, and immediately jumps to the conclusion that this is the solution. The result may be short-lasting. You may ultimately end yourself back where you began. So you want to see if that's the case, which means you've got to be able to sit with things. The same principle applies with the other properties. Fire can burn unpleasant things, but it doesn't shrink away from them. Water can be used to wash away unpleasant things, but doesn't get disgusted. Wind blows unpleasant things around and doesn't show distaste. So you learn to be grounded. Remind yourself that whatever comes up, you can bear it. I remember once when I was staying with Ajahn Fuang, he told me out of the blue one day to sit up and meditate all night. My immediate reaction was that it wasn't a good day for me to try that. I had been working hard that day. I said, I couldn't do it. He looked at me and said, well, is it going to kill you? Well, no. Then you can do it. That's the attitude you've got to have. As with that saying, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. But in the midst of doing difficult things, you don't just soar through them. You've got to go out, how can I get through this without soaring? That's where you start learning how to be ingenious. But the important thing is that you remind yourself, okay, you can stand this, whatever's coming up, you're not going to get blown around. That way you can begin to trust yourself as an observer. Then, to show that the Buddha wasn't teaching Rahula to be passive, the next 4 meditations are about replacing unskillful attitudes with more skillful ones, essentially the attitudes of the Brahma Viharas. Goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. Although here the Buddha isn't asking him to develop these thoughts to the limitless extent of Brahma Viharas. He's simply telling him to replace various levels of aversion in the mind, irritation, resentment, ill will, or the desire to harm, with more positive emotions. If you notice ill will coming up in the mind, try counteracting it with goodwill. Don't just allow the mind to stay stuck with its ill will. You do what you can to foster an attitude of goodwill to whomever the person may be. If the idea comes up that you'd like to be cruel or harmful to somebody, counteract it with an attitude of compassion, Reminding yourself that you're not going to bean tea from that person sewering in any way at all. In fact, when other people are sewering, that's when they tend to do crazy, ill-considered, unskillful things. You've got to have some compassion for people who are engaged in unskillful activities, hoping that they'll learn the good sense to stop. Empathetic joy is the antidote for any feelings of resentment you may feel for somebody else's good fortune. You realize that resentment doesn't do you any good at all. People who are enjoying good fortune must have done something sometime that leads to happiness, so why resent it? Do you want people to resent good fortune when it comes your way? Of course not. As for feelings of equanimity, these are meant to counteract feelings of irritation. You want to be equanimous toward irritating things, so that irritation doesn't build up to the point where it makes you do something stupid. In each of these cases, you want to be skilled at giving rise to skillful attitudes when you need them, so that you don't just sit there stewing in aversion. Then the Buddha taught 2 meditations for counteracting other sorts of unskillful qualities. For lust, he said to try to develop the perception of the foulness of the human body. Now this is not about having an unhealthy negative image of the body, it's actually training in having a healthy negative image of the body. You realize that everybody is in the same boat this way. We're all led with blood, pus, contents of the stomach, contents of the intestines, all kinds of stew you wouldn't like to have on the ewer here in the morning, when we're getting the meal ready. This is a useful antidote. When feelings of lust come up and you think about what lies under the skin, it's hard to maintain sexual desire. So again, the Buddha is not teaching Rahula to be passive, or simply to accept whatever's coming up. He's telling him how to counteract unskillful attitudes and replace them with skillful ones. In the now preparation, before teaching Rahula breath meditation, the Buddha taught him something that's usually considered to be a very advanced teaching. He said, try to develop the perception of inconstancy, to counteract the conceit, I am. Now notice. The Buddha is putting this right at the beginning. One of the reasons for this is that when skillful and unskillful things come up in the mind, if you immediately brand yourself as I'm the sort of person who's always skillful or I'm the sort of person who's always unskillful, that's going to get in the way of actually seeing which actions in the mind are having a helpful impact and which ones are not. If, when something that looks unskillful comes up, and you immediately react to it, my gosh, I'm a really bad meditator, I'm miserable, look at this horrible thought, I shouldn't be thinking this. You either feel self-hatred or you start going into denial, pretending that it didn't actually happen. Neither reaction helps develop any insight at all. If you engage in denial, you can't see what you're doing, can't see whether the intention was actually skillful or not, and can't see the results of the action. And you certainly can't counteract denial if you don't admit that it's there. Or if you build the other kind of I am around the unskillful thought, that I'm miserable, that really shoots you down, saps your ability to counteract the thought. This is the problem with I am. It starts getting to issues of innate nature. If you have a bad innate nature, you can't change it. If you have a good innate good nature, then when something that looks skillful arises in the mind, you immediately read it as a sign of your innate goodness. You start getting complacent and careless, and you don't really see whether there's anything unskillful lurking under the surface. Where does this particular intention really lead? What needs to be done with it? Is it really as good as it seems at first glance? If you decide that it's part of your innate Buddha nature, you get complacent. So again, you miss out on things, don't really see things as they're happening, because the I am gets in the way. It's interesting. The Pali word for conceit mana doesn't mean only a sense that you're better than other people. If you say, I'm worse than other people or I'm equal to other people, that's conceit as well, because you're still building the I am around things. There are several ways to get around this. The RST is the Buddha's advice to Rahula. Whatever comes up is inconstant. It doesn't last, so it's not enough to build an identity around. Another way around the I am is that, whatever comes up in the mind, you remind yourself that this happens to everybody. Remind yourself that you don't have any innate nature. The mind is neutral. It just knows. The thinking is skillful or unskillful, but those are habits which aren't innate at all. Or you can do what the Buddha did. This is something people tend to forget when they meditate. On the night of his awakening, his RST knowledge was about himself, his narratives. You think you have narratives? He had narratives going way back, eons and eons. But he didn't jump straight from there to the present moment. He took a detour and thought about all the beings in the world. How about them? He saw that they all went through the same process, all different kinds of birth and rebirth, and on seeing them in a more universal way, he was able to see underlying patterns. What kind of actions were skillful? What kind of views underlay skillful actions that lead to fortunate rebirths? And how unskillful actions lead to unfortunate ones? It was by looking at the large picture that he was able to see patterns. Only then did he look at the present moment from the perspective of those larger patterns. That helps cut through the I am and the individual narratives. You're looking at events common to beings all over the world, and you're looking at them in light of those larger patterns, not of natures but of actions. When you're looking at greed, anger, and delusion in the mind in this way, it helps to loosen some of this sense of identity around them. Another way to loosen that sense of identity is to think of the mind as a committee. The committee contains all kinds of members who propose all kinds of things. Just because somebody in the committee has proposed a bad idea doesn't mean the committee is bad. The duty of the committee is to listen to the ideas brought to the Urgur out, which is the best one to act on right now. If they make a mistake, they go back and undo the old decision, open the Ur to suggestions, and arrive at a new decision. They don't worry about the innate nature of the committee. When you can see events in the mind in this way, then you're really ready to meditate, because it allows you to deal with them just as events, as instances of intention and the results of intentions. When you put aside the I am, you're in a much better position to see things for what they actually do, and then you can deal with them in the most appropriate way. It was only after the Buddha taught Rahula all of these things that he said, "Okay, sit down. This is how you do breath meditation." So when you sit down to do breath meditation, it's good to react on these attitudes. They're your tools, your means for reading the events that are arising and passing away, and also for reading the results of applying different techniques. They help you figure out which technique is useful for which kind of issue, what's getting results, what's not getting results. That's how you develop your discernment. You see cause and effect, skillful and unskillful, i.e., the Four Noble Truths. You develop the path, so you can comprehend suffering and eventually let go of its cause. That's how you realize the end of suffering. By experimenting, by exploring, by bringing the right attitudes and the right mental qualities to whichever meditation technique you choose. Those qualities are the factors that make all the difference. So do your best to bring the full set of mature qualities to meditation. That's how you get results. Establishing priorities. September 11, 2008. When you start to meditate, it's important that you make a RM determination, establishing the RM intention that you're going to stay with the breath for the entire hour. And it's good to remind yourself of the reasons for why you want to do this, because that helps to RM up the intention. We're here because we want a happiness that's blameless, a happiness that's dependable, a happiness that'll last. And this is the road that leads there. Training the mind. The Buddha once said that the difference between a wise person and a foolish one is that the foolish person sees no need to train the mind. Happiness can be bought, happiness can be taken. That's the foolish person's attitude. But the wise person sees that the pursuit of that kind of happiness actually leads to a lot of unhappiness. Whatever little happiness it does produce isn't dependable. It requires that conditions be a certain way, conditions that lie totally outside your control. The fact that those conditions are unstable means that the happiness coming from them is going to be unstable as well. So react on that. Sometimes you hear theories about how causality works in life. And in many philosophies and religions, causality typically starts with an unmoved mover, something permanent, something good that gives rise to everything we experience. The question, of course, is, why does a permanent cause lead to changeable results? Why does a good cause lead to undesirable results? Those ideas of causality are no help at all. If something is undesirable, where do you go back and change the cause to make it more desirable? If the cause is unchanging, you're stymied. But as the Buddha saw, causes change too, and effects can have an effect on causes. This is one of the reasons why things are so unstable and unreliable, but it's also part of the way out. The causes of sewering can be changed, which means that you actually can put an end to sewering. The Buddha's approach was not to simply accept sewering as a given in life, that it has to be that way, and we simply learn how to accept it, and that's the end of the problem. He saw that sewering can actually be brought to an end. And the causes of sewering are largely internal, which means that the way to put an end to sewering is largely an internal job as well. As someone once said, true happiness is an inside job. That's why we train the mind to search for the causes within it that lead to sewering and see what we can do to change them. Keep this point in mind as you practice, because a common experience in meditation is that you sit here focused on the breath, and then after a while, suddenly realize that you haven't been with the breath at all. You've been someplace else. There was a lapse of mindfulness, a lapse of alertness. You're usually surprised that it's happened, but you shouldn't be. Expect that the mind will come up with alternative intentions in the course of the hour, and be on the lookout for them. So while you're focused on the breath, you also have to be heedful of the fact that you could lose the breath at any moment. This means that you want to do your best to strengthen your focus, strengthen your mindfulness, strengthen your alertness. And one way to do that is, as soon as you catch yourself wandering, immediately come back to the breath, but without engaging in self-recrimination. Don't berate yourself for losing the breath. If you do, you'll tie yourself up in another long discourse that'll take you away from the breath again. Just drop the distraction in its unniched state and come back to the breath as quickly as possible. Re-establish yourself and try to get interested in the breath. As the Buddha said, using your powers of analysis is actually one way of leading the mind into concentration. For people who can't calm the mind simply by sticking with the breath, it's good to look into the breath as a process to explore. How does the breathing affect the body? How does the effect of the breath on the body have an effect on the mind? How can you maximize the positive effects? What kind of breathing would feel really good? And when it feels good, what can you do with that good feeling? The Buddha suggests spreading it around, allowing it to permeate the body throughout. So there's plenty to do here. It's not just in out, in out, in out. When the breath comes in, explore how it's coming in, how it affects different parts of the body. When it goes out, explore and experiment to see what's the most comfortable way of allowing it to go out. All too often our cartoon notion of the breath coming in and going out requires that we squeeze it out when it goes out. But you don't want to do that. The squeezing is actually depleting the breath energy in the body. Try telling yourself that you'll help the breath come in, but when it goes out, it can go out on its own. You don't have to push it. You don't have to squeeze it. That way you can begin to maintain a sense of fullness that carries from the in-breath even through the out-breath. When you breathe with that sense of continual fullness, the breath feels a lot better. It becomes a lot more interesting. You begin to realize that this breath work we do in the body is a useful way of getting the mind interested in the breath, so that you don't have to force it to stay here. You're here through the power of your curiosity. At the same time, you have to keep an eye on the mind to notice when it begins to show signs that it's about to wander. Maybe it's a little impatient, maybe the results aren't coming as fast as you'd like. Nothing seems to be changing. The mind starts looking for someplace else to go, something else to think about. If you're really alert, you can catch it before a distracting thought is fully formed. The more quickly you can see that process, the better. You can feel that stirring of a form or a thought beginning to occur, like a little tingling or a little stirring around, a little knot in the breath energy. At that point, it's hard to say whether it's physical or mental. It could be either. There will come a point, though, When the mind decides that the stirring is a potential for a thought, it looks into it and turns it into a thought world. The more quickly you can see that happening, the more you're able to zap it at the very beginning of the stirring. This too is something you'll learn in the course of exploring the breath. So even though we say to keep one eye on the breath and the other eye on the potential for the mind to leave, when you really look carefully at the breath, you'll ND that the potential for it to leave is right there as well, in the little knots or stirrings that can develop in the breath energy. So you don't have to split your focus. In this way you can help maintain your original intention to stay continually with the breath because it's interesting, because there are lots of things here to learn. A similar principle applies when you leave meditation because you really don't want to leave totally. You spent all this time getting the mind to settle down, and it would be a shame just to throw it away. So there is a skill to leaving meditation as well, a skill to opening your eyes. When you open your eyes, remind yourself that the breath body is still here, the sense of energy in the body is still here. All too often when we open our eyes, all our attention goes owing out into the visual world, and our sense of the body gets shrunken down, pushed aside, blotted out. You want to learn how not to do that. In other words, you can be aware of the visual world at the same time that you're aware of the breath energy world. You might ask yourself, which contains which? Does your sense of the body contain your awareness of the visual world, or does the visual world contain your sense of the body? See which way of conceiving this relationship helps you to maintain that sense of breath awareness even as you open your eyes, get up and move around, negotiate the outside world, so that your breath awareness becomes more continuous. This allows you to learn things about the mind, to develop new skills in the course of daily life. You learn how to maintain a sense of ease even in difficult situations, a sense of fullness at times when your mind would otherwise be daydreaming or drifting around. Instead of wasting your time drifting, you can stay right here and continue to explore the sense of the body, the breath energy body inside. You can also begin to sense which things knock you out of balance, distract you, pull you out of the body. When you see that happening, you've found an issue to explore. This is how concentration leads to insight. It provides you with a still center from which you can watch the movements of the mind and see where they go. This way you can detect. This is what a dilemma is like. It blocks the mind, obscures the mind. You check into it. Is it greed, anger, delusion, lust, fear, jealousy? What are the things that spark these emotions? You see the dilemmas in real time. If you're able to do this, then the next time you sit down it's going to be a lot easier to stay with the breath more continuously. But if you develop the habit of throwing away your concentration as soon as you get up, it's going to be easier to throw it away in the midst of your meditation. You've got to keep in mind the fact that the mind has to be trained if you want to gain true happiness, and you don't want to train the mind only when you sit here with your eyes closed. You want the training to be 24/7, because the mind's potential to create problems is 24/7 as well. So it's a matter of establishing your priorities. What kind of happiness do you want? What are you willing to give up to attain that happiness? How much time and energy are you planning to invest, willing to invest to end true happiness? This is another aspect of wisdom. Keeping your priorities clear. If true happiness is the top priority, that helps to pull the mind out of its ignorance. In other words, its overriding concern for other issues and to bring the issue of sewering and the causes of sewering up to the fore. That's what clear knowing is all about, making it your clear priority that the issue of sewering is paramount. This is the most important issue to deal with. When the Buddha talks about ignorance, he's not talking about a general lack of knowledge about things. You can know many things and still be ignorant of the big issue. And part of that ignorance comes from the fact that you don't really regard the big issue as the big issue. You've got other priorities, other agendas. But the Buddha wants you to see that the question of sewering is the big issue in life. Your ability to train yourself to put an end to it should be your top priority. When I was up in Bellingham this last weekend, I was out walking after the meal. A guy looked at me and asked, "Buddhist?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why are there so many religions in the world?" I answered, "Because the different religions ask different questions." So what's the Buddha's question? His question is, why are we suffering and what can we do to put an end to it? Don't you just hate that question? He said. I said, no, I think it's a pretty good question. The fact that there's suffering is something you might not like, and it's natural not to like it, but it would be strange to hate the question of why it happens and how you can put an end to it. We should regard this as the most important question to try to answer, because it's the most useful, most fruitful question we can explore. It's a privilege to be able to ask this question and answer it. That's why one of the duties with regard to the Four Noble Truths is to develop the path, the way out of suffering. This is what we're doing here right now. So wisdom is largely a matter of priorities. As you're sitting in meditation, as you go through life, your top priority should be to stay here with the breath, so as to develop the powers of mindfulness, concentration, and discernment that will allow you to realize the end of suffering. A lot of the practice is learning how to stick to those priorities and not let other priorities sneak in. How to feed mindfulness. August 3, 2008. We sit here with a lot of potentials. Potential sensations in the body, potential qualities in the mind. The practice of meditation is learning how to put aside the unskillful potentials, how to develop the skillful ones, and how to take advantage of the skillful ones, learning how to feed them, to give them strength, so that they basically take charge and help put an end to suffering and stress. You could, if you wanted to, sit here and spend the whole hour thinking about all kinds of random frivolous things. Or you could sit here creating a lot of pain. Psychologists studying the nervous system have discovered that there are times when you have a sensation of pain, but there's really nothing, no pain signal, coming in at the end of the nerve. The monitoring stations along the nerve interpret a particular signal as a pain signal, and so that's what they send on up the line. That means that you could sit here focusing on whatever potentials for pain there are, and you could turn almost anything into a pain, but you don't. You focus on the potentials for pleasure. Notice, when the breath comes in, where it's feeling good, which part of the breath cycle feels nicest? Is it the middle of the breath, the beginning of the breath, the end of the breath? Can you notice when the breath is getting too long? Can you catch yourself squeezing the breath as it goes out? When you squeeze it, you're weakening the potential for pleasure that the breath can give. Someplace in the middle of the in-breath there's a point of balance. You might want to focus your attention there and maximize that particular sensation, which means that the breath will get shorter and shorter, more and more subtle as it hovers around that point of balance. If that's too subtle to notice, simply be aware of when the breath is too long, when it's too short, too shallow, too deep. Which parts of the body would feel better if they were given a greater role in the breathing process? Try to gure out. Which ways of breathing will help to develop the potentials of comfort, ease, refreshment, fullness in the body? As you do this, you're developing good potentials in the mind as well. The two major ones are mindfulness and alertness. I recently read someone saying that mindfulness is an unfabricated phenomenon, that only your thought processes that pull you away from the present moment count as fabricated, that when you're in the pure present, there's no fabrication going on at all. But that's a major misunderstanding. Mindfulness is something you do. It's a fabricated activity. Alertness is something you do. It's a fabricated activity as well. And there are potentials in the mind that can either foster the mindfulness or starve it. In other words, mindfulness is something you have to feed. It's not your simple awareness. It's the ability to keep something in mind. The reason we don't understand things, the reason we don't see the connection between cause and effect, is because we forget. It's because we forget that we can't stick with our resolves. Say you decide you're going to stay here for a whole hour with the breath, and minutes later you end yourself planning tomorrow's meal or thinking about events far away in Iceland. What happened? You forgot. And why did you forget? Well, there was a blanking out for a moment or two because you weren't paying proper attention to the causes for mindfulness. The Buddha identifies two qualities that feed mindfulness and help it grow. The RST is well-purified virtue. Virtue here means the intention not to harm. Not to do harm to yourself, not to do harm to other living beings. If you have harmful intentions in mind, part of the mind goes along with them, and part of the mind doesn't. There's a conflict. And one of the mind's tricks for going along with the harmful intention is to allow itself to forget that the intention is actually harmful. If this becomes a habit, it's hard to develop mindfulness because you're running up against these walls of forgetfulness that the mind very insistently wants to keep up. Your mindfulness runs up against them and gets directed. This is why people in Thailand, before they meditate, sometimes make a vow. I'm going to observe the V precepts. I'm going to stick with them. And I'm sincere in that resolution. This is even easier when you already have been following the V precepts. You react on your actions, and there is nothing you regret. You don't have to go into denial. That way it's easier for mindfulness to be continuous. But the simple act of resolving to be harmless in all your activities, harmless in what you do, harmless in what you say, harmless in what you think can begin to create the right conditions for mindfulness immediately. Make that a principle you want to hold to. The other quality that helps feed mindfulness is views made straight in the sense that they're in line with the truth. Understanding that your actions will have consequences, that skillful intentions will tend to lead to pleasant results, unskillful intentions to unpleasant results. This is a principle that wasn't just made up by somebody. It's been observed by people who have developed their minds to the point where they really can see what's going on. And on the basis of that, you realize, for example, that generosity is a good thing, gratitude is a good thing, because people do have the choice to act skillfully or unskillfully. You have to be grateful for the times when they've chosen to be skillful, and grateful to yourself for the times you've chosen to be skillful, because thinking in this way helps to break down the barriers in the mind that say, I don't want to think about the Dhamma right now. I want to think about sex, or I want to think about drugs, or I want to think about who knows what. If there's part of the mind that says, hey, you can't do that without consequences, you've got your RST line of defense against those wandering, unskillful thoughts. Then there will be part of the mind that says, I don't want to think about that because it means I've been acting unskillfully in the past, and it just hurts too much to think about that. That's where the Buddha recommends developing the right attitude toward your past mistakes. It's not inevitable that you're going to have to suffer a lot from your past mistakes. As the Buddha said, if you can develop an attitude of limitless goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity, that'll mitigate the results of your past bad actions. If you can train yourself so that the mind isn't overcome by pleasure, isn't overcome by pain, in other words, you don't let these feelings get in the way of your seeing what's actually going on, then again, the mind is immune, or at least the results of your past mistakes will be mitigated. So the proper attitude to have toward your past bad actions is, 1. Realize that remorse is not going to undo them. Simply make the resolve that you're not going to repeat those actions again. And then, 2. Try to develop attitudes of limitless goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. When the meditation gets dry, bring out these attitudes and work on spreading them around, realizing that other people's unhappiness isn't going to help you in any way, nor is your unhappiness going to help you in any way. So why would you wish for anybody's unhappiness? Even with people who have been cruel and unprincipled, you realize that if they suffer more, they'll probably get even more cruel, more unprincipled. So try to picture them learning to see to the error of their ways and changing their ways. In other words, you wish for them to start creating the causes for happiness. You don't feel that you have to settle old scores RST before you let them be happy or wise. When you learn how to think in these ways, it helps to cut through a lot of the barriers you create in the mind, a lot of the unskillful attitudes that can get in the way of continual mindfulness. So when you've lowered the walls, you can see back into the past and ahead into the future. You can start seeing the connections between actions and their results. When you focus the mind in a certain way, what are the results over time? If you're mindful of your actions, you can really see this for yourself. If you change the way you focus, if you change the way you breathe, what effect does that have over time? Sometimes the effects are immediate, sometimes they take a while to seep in. Only if you're really mindful can you see the long-term effects. Only if you're alert can you see the short-term effects. This is why mindfulness and alertness have to go together. I was reading a Dhamma talk by Upasakukhi last night, in which she was saying that real insight, as soon as it sees, lets go in that very moment. It's not that you see in one moment and let go in the next. You see and you let go in the seeing, right there and then. That kind of insight requires very quick alertness. But the ability to develop that kind of alertness requires solid mindfulness, long-term mindfulness, so that you can understand how you get the mind in the right place to see things clearly to begin with. All too often when people sit and meditate, the meditation either goes poorly, and they have no idea why it's going poorly, or it goes well and they have no idea why it's going well. That's because they haven't been watching mindfully. They watch for a little bit and then they forget. Then they come back, and then they forget, so that they don't really see the connections. Mindfulness is what keeps the practice in mind and allows you to remember what you did, so you can understand the connection between what you did and the results you're getting. Alertness is what allows you to see what you're doing right now. When you develop the resolve to act only on skillful intentions and the proper understanding of how your actions shape your life, those are the conditions that feed mindfulness, that allow mindfulness and alertness to grow strong. So it's not the case that people can just walk in the street, sit down, and develop mindfulness. It takes the ability to look at your life and make some decisions about how you're going to live and how you understand the best way of living. That's when mindfulness has a chance. Permission to play. March 16, 2009. Focus on your breath. Know when it's coming in, know when it's going out. Notice where you feel it, the sensations that tell you when it's coming in and going out, and then keep your attention focused on those sensations. You have to be careful, though, in how you focus. If you put too much pressure on the breath, it starts getting constricted. If your attention to the breath is too light, it slips and oats away. So just the right amount of pressure to maintain on the breath here, meaning the pressure of your attention, but allow the breath to out as freely as possible in the body. We often make the mistake of tensing up around something in order to highlight it in our attention or to stay focused on it, but that'll get in the way of the breath's being a pleasurable place to stay. Which is what you need as you meditate, a good place to stay, because if the mind doesn't any sense of ease in the present moment, it's going to go wandering looking for ease and pleasure someplace else. So experiment with the breathing. You can do it in one of two ways. The RST is simply to pose the question in your mind with each breath. What kind of breathing would feel really good right now? See how the body responds. Or you can go about it more systematically. To expand your sense of what the breath is capable of, ask yourself, what would longer breathing feel like? And think of the breath going longer for a while. Then how about still longer? What would that feel like? And then go shorter, deeper or more shallow, heavier or lighter. Try to push the envelope until you gain a sense of what kind of breathing really does feel good right now. It's important that you learn how to play with the breath in this way. This may seem counterintuitive. After all, we're trying to get to something unconditioned and unfabricated, and yet here we go about it by fabricating. But that's what the whole path is. A kind of fabrication. Every factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, from right view through right concentration, is something put together. It's a fabrication. It's something you will through bodily fabrication, verbal fabrication, and mental fabrication. I.e., through the breath, through directed thought and evaluation, and through feeling and perception. But to will skillfully, you have to bring these fabrications together in a way that makes the path pleasant to follow. Otherwise you can't stick with it. This is why right concentration is such an important part of the path. It gives you a good place to stay, a sense of ease, well-being, refreshment, or rapture that nourishes and sustains your ability to stick with the path. So play around with the breath. Think of fabrication as playing, and you have permission to play. Don't think that playing around in this way is going to get in the way of insight. It actually helps create the conditions for insight to arise. For one, it gives stamina to the practice. If you're simply sitting with whatever comes up, meditation becomes an exercise in brute endurance. If no pleasure's coming up in the meditation, no sense of rapture or gratification, it becomes dull and unattractive. You find it harder and harder to actually sit down and keep up with the practice day after day. But if you allow the meditation to be a process of exploring, of finding what's really comfortable right now, you can stick with it. It becomes something interesting, something you want to do. As you're sticking with this process of experimenting with the breath, getting it more pleasurable and allowing that sense of pleasure to seep throughout the body, it gives you a steadier base in the present moment. The interest you develop in exploring the breath energy in the body helps you stay steadily in the present as well. If the meditation is simply a matter of watching whatever comes up, it gets boring very quickly. The mind's going to find reasons to do other things, to slip away and find other things that seem more interesting or important. But if you allow yourself to explore, your curiosity makes you want to stay here, to stay sensitive and steadily focused. At the same time, allowing the breath to be comfortable gives you a safe foundation in the present moment, a foundation you're going to need because pains will come up. We need the right attitude toward pain. Not to feel threatened, not to run away. Our duty with regard to pain is to comprehend it, but you're not going to comprehend it if you feel threatened by it. So it's good to know that you have a safe, comfortable place to return to whenever you need it. Say there's a pain in your leg and you're not really ready to deal with it yet. You can focus on whatever sense of ease and fullness you can develop elsewhere in the body, say, in the chest, in the stomach, in your hands, in your feet, through the way you breathe. If things get bad with the pain, you can go back to the breath. Once the mind feels nourished and protected by the breath, it'll be more willing to actually look into the pain, probe into the pain, trying to understand. What is this pain I have in my body? Why do I fear it so much? Is it really as fearsome as it seems? As you get interested in exploring the pain, you start taking it apart. Which part of the pain is actually a physical sensation, and which part is the mental perception that makes things worse in the mind? And even with that physical sensation, which part of it actually is a pain? Because you also have sensations of the different elements in your body, which are more like properties of how the body feels from within. There's solidity, liquidity, warmth, and energy. How does the pain relate to those? It's a different kind of sensation. Liquid is just liquid. Solid is just solid. It doesn't have to be painful. In fact, these sensations are a different order of sensation entirely from the pain. But there's a pain knitting around in there. If you glom it together with the physical properties, especially the property of earth or solidity, you make the pain seem a lot more solid and threatening than it actually is. If you're coming from a position of well-being, a position of inner security, it's easier to explore and see these things happening because your agenda isn't necessarily to make the pain go away. You're curious. You want to learn about it. And as you develop a greater sensitivity to the breathing, a greater sensitivity to how you fashion the breath and how intention plays a role in your experience of the breath, you start seeing more and more subtle levels of stress that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. You see more subtle levels of fabrication that you wouldn't have seen otherwise as well. Because one of the big lessons in the meditation is that the present moment is not a given. You're actually shaping the present moment with your intentions. And the best way to sensitize yourself to those intentions and their role in fashioning the present is to try to fashion it skillfully. This way you get a sense of when you should try to change things, and when you shouldn't, which problems in the body or in the mind respond to active intervention, and which ones respond better when you simply watch them with equanimity. As you put the mind in a better mood through giving it a good comfortable place to stay, or giving it something to explore with the breath, it becomes more open to seeing its own mistakes. It can even admit its mistakes with a greater sense of cheerfulness because it sees that they don't have to be repeated. If the mind is in a bad mood, it's like a person in a foul mood. If you want to talk to him about where he's been unskillful, where he's been outrageous or whatever in his behavior, he won't want to hear anything you say. He's going to resist. But if he's rested and well fed and in a good mood, it's a lot easier to broach the topic of his shortcomings. And the same with the mind. A lot of what we're going to learn in the process of understanding the mind is in seeing its subterfuges, where it lies to itself, where it's been dishonest with itself, all of which are things we don't like to see. Yet if we don't admit these things to ourselves, insight will never have a chance. You can't just put the mind through a meditation grinder and hope that the process is going to take care of it. The mind has to develop the sensitivity to see where it's been lying to itself, where it's been dishonest with itself, for genuine insight to arise. So this game we play with the breath helps put you in the right mood to learn those lessons. Try to explore how to get the breath more comfortable, more rened, seeing how still you can get both the breath and the mind, without forcing them unnaturally. After all, you're working with a sense of ease, so you can't force it to the point where the ease dies away. This means that you need to develop your powers of sensitivity. You need to have a sense of how much dling around becomes too much dling around. When the breath gets comfortable enough that you can stay with the body, when it feels good to be with the whole body breathing in, the whole body breathing out, then you just allow it to do its thing. And as the mind calms down, the breath calms down as well. This is a common pattern throughout the Buddha's meditation instructions. You try to get a sense of what fabrication is going on, and then once you're sensitive to the process of fabrication, you allow it to grow still. This gives you some insight into the fact that you're shaping the present moment. You develop the desire to do it with more skill, with more ness, with a greater sense of sensitivity and subtlety. And you can get there only by consciously trying to fabricate things. Fabricating your sense of the body through the breathing, and fabricating your mind through the perceptions you hold. The sensitivity that develops over time is what allows you to see the subtleties of these processes. If you try to lay down the rule in the beginning that I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to watch what's already there, a lot of what's really happening in the present moment goes underground where you can't see it. But as you consciously try to fabricate a sense of well-being in the body, a sense of ease in the mind through the way you breathe, through the way you relate to the breath, then you bring these processes up to the surface. You see them more clearly. This brings more honesty into the mind. So it's important, as you meditate, that you realize you have permission to play, are encouraged to play, with the breath. This is how maturity develops in any eld. Children who don't get a chance to play never really mature. The same principle applies to meditators. If you don't learn how to play with the present moment, you never develop a mature understanding of what's going on in the present moment. When you don't really understand the role of intention in forming the present moment, you never get to the point where you can drop every element of intention that's creating the present. And only when you drop the last shred of intention can there be an opening to something outside of the present, beyond space and time, to that happiness we're all looking for, which is totally independent of conditions, totally reliable. And only when we have a reliable happiness can we rely on ourselves. You see this everywhere now. The economy's collapsing. There are more murders out there, more suicides, more robberies as people's sense of well-being gets more and more threatened. This is when you really get to see how strong people's sense of their inner wealth is. The more wealth you have inside, the less you're worried about wealth outside. The less you worry about wealth outside, the more you can trust yourself to do the skillful thing, to say the skillful thing, to think the skillful thing in any situation. If you can train the mind to the point where it's found something that can't be touched by anything in space and time, but can be touched through inner awareness, as the Buddha says, you touch it with the body, or you see it with the body. In other words, it's a total experience. It's not just a vision, it's not just an idea, it's visceral. Once you've had your RST taste of that, you know you have a happiness you can depend on. This means you can depend on your mind as well. The other pleasures of the world become less important and are less likely to tempt you to do unskillful things to attain them and protect them, because you realize you have something that doesn't need protection. That's where the meditation gets really good. But the only way you can develop the maturity needed to end that mature happiness is the same way any person develops maturity. You start out by playing around, learning about cause and effect by nudging things to see what they do in response. You nudge this cause, i.e., the breath, to see what that does to the mind, what it does to the sense of ease in the body, and then nudge another cause. Say, your perception of the breath. If you see the breath only as air coming in and out of the lungs, you're really limiting yourself. Think of other ways you might perceive this energy in the body, owing through the blood vessels, owing through the nerves, owing around the nerves, owing out to every pore in the skin, owing around the body just beyond the skin, having everything in and around the body all connecting up. Imagine these images of cutting roads through a jungle till you have a whole system of interconnecting roads. Communication gets easier. Information flows more smoothly. It's by playing around in this way that you start outgrowing your childish attitudes. It's through play that children become adults. So each time you sit down and meditate, remember you have permission to play. It's what the meditation is all about. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.